She had only her life left. Yet the cowboy still dragged the frozen Nez Perce woman inside. The winter had come early that year, and it had come with a quiet strength that made the whole valley feel small and still. Snow covered the ground like a thick white blanket, hiding the rocks, the dry grass, and the narrow paths that once led through the land. The sky was pale and heavy, and the wind moved slowly between the hills, carrying the sound of nothing at all. In the middle of this wide and silent place stood a small wooden cabin, built by one man's hands and kept alive by his will to stay. The cowboy had lived there for many years, long enough to forget what it felt like to hear many voices around him. His days were simple and steady. He woke before the sun, fed his horses, checked his fence, and kept the fire burning inside his cabin. He had learned to listen to the land, to the way the wind changed before a storm, and to the way the animals moved when danger was near. The valley was his only neighbor, and the cold was his constant guest. That evening, the sky darkened earlier than usual. Clouds rolled in slowly, like a soft wall closing off the world. The cowboy pulled his coat tighter around his body and stepped outside to check the fence one last time before the storm grew stronger. His boots pressed into the snow, leaving deep marks that filled back in as the wind brushed over them. His breath rose into the air in small white clouds. As he walked toward the frozen river, he noticed something that did not belong. At first, it looked like a shadow or a fallen tree branch half covered by snow. He stopped and squinted, trying to make sense of it. The shape was too smooth, too still. A strange feeling moved through him. Not fear, but a quiet warning that made him step closer. The closer he got, the clearer it became. It was a person. A woman lay near the riverbank. Her dark hair spread across the snow like a thin line of night against the white ground. Her clothes were stiff with cold, and her body barely moved. The cowboy felt his heart beat faster, not from the cold, but from the sudden weight of the moment. He knelt beside her and touched her arm. Her skin was cold, but not completely without warmth. She was still alive. He looked around, as if expecting someone else to appear, someone who could explain how she had ended up there. But the land was empty. Only the wind answered him, brushing against his coat and moving the snow across the ground. The cowboy knew who she was by the patterns on her clothing and the small details in her design work. Brrr! She was Nez Perce. He had seen people from her community passing through the valley in warmer seasons, moving along old paths that had been there long before his cabin. He had never spoken to them, only watched from a distance, unsure of how his presence was seen by those who had lived on this land long before him. Now here she was, alone in the cold, her life hanging by a thin thread. For a moment he stayed still, caught between two thoughts. One told him to step back, to leave things as they were, to return to his cabin and let the world move on its own path. The other told him that if he walked away, this woman would not survive the night. The storm was coming, and the cold would only grow stronger. He took a slow breath and made his choice. Carefully, he slid one arm under her shoulders and the other under her legs. She was lighter than he expected, her body weak and still. He stood up, feeling the strain in his back and legs as he lifted her. The wind pushed against him as he turned toward the cabin, but he leaned forward and kept moving, step by step, leaving a new trail in the snow. The cabin door was stiff with ice, and he struggled to open it while holding her. When it finally gave way, warm air rushed out to meet them. He carried her inside and laid her down near the fire, which still glowed softly from the morning. He added more wood, and the flames grew brighter, filling the small room with light and heat. The cabin was simple. A small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and shelves lined with tools and supplies. The walls were rough and the floor creaked under his steps. It was not a place made for visitors, but it was the only shelter he had to offer. He wrapped her in blankets, covering her from her feet up to her shoulders. He watched her chest closely, counting each slow rise and fall. Every breath she took felt like a small victory. He filled a cup with warm water and held it near her lips, but she did not wake. He set it aside and sat down on one of the chairs, rubbing his hands together to bring feeling back into them. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the room. Time passed in a slow and careful way. Outside, the storm began to speak, the wind tapping against the walls and the snow falling harder against the roof. Inside, the cowboy kept his eyes on the woman, ready to move at the smallest sign of change. Breath. He thought about the life he had chosen, the quiet days, the long nights, the way the land had become both his home and his shield. He had believed he needed nothing else. Now, with another person lying on his floor, he felt something shift inside him. The cabin did not feel as empty as it once had. Hours later, the woman moved, but at something of fresh mash and a slight turn of her head. But the cowboy noticed it right away. He stood up and stepped closer. Her eyes opened just a little, dark and confused. She looked around the room, her gaze moving from the fire to the walls, then to him. He raised his hand slowly, showing her that he meant no harm. He spoke softly, his voice low and steady, even though he was not sure she could understand his words. "You're safe," he said. "You're warm now." She did not answer, but her eyes stayed on him. There was fear there, but also a tired kind of calm, as if she did not have the strength to run even if she wanted to. He backed away and sat down again, giving her space. He knew trust did not come quickly, especially in a place like this, between two people who came from different worlds. The fire continued to burn and the storm continued to sing outside. Inside the small cabin, two lives rested under the same roof, connected by a single moment on a frozen riverbank. As the night went on, the cowboy stayed awake, listening to the sound of her breathing and the wind beyond the walls. He did not know what the morning would bring. He did not know how long she would stay or where she would go when she was strong again. All he knew was that he had made a choice, and that choice had filled his quiet cabin with something he had not felt in a long time. Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself was tired from the long night. The light crept through the small window of the cabin, touching the wooden floor and the edge of the table. The fire had burned low, leaving only soft red embers that still gave a gentle warmth to the room. The cowboy sat in his chair, his head resting against the wall. He had not slept much. Every sound, every movement from the woman on the floor had kept him awake. When he heard her breathe a little stronger, he lifted his head and stood up. He walked to the small shelf where he kept his supplies. He took out a cup and poured fresh water from a clay jug. He set it near the fire to warm, careful not to let it get too hot. The woman lay wrapped in the blankets, her face calmer than it had been the night before. Her eyes were closed, but her hands were no longer stiff. They rested softly on her chest, rising and falling with each breath. The cowboy moved slowly, trying not to make loud sounds. He added a small piece of wood to the fire, watching the flames grow and light the room again. The smell of burning wood mixed with the cold air that still clung to his coat. Inspirations. After a while, the woman opened her eyes. This time, she looked around more clearly. Her gaze moved from the ceiling to the fire, then to the cowboy. She did not sit up right away. Instead, she watched him, trying to understand where she was and who he was. The cowboy stayed still. He held the cup of warm water in both hands and waited. He did not want to rush her. He spoke softly. "You made it through the night." She blinked, her eyes narrowing just a little. She tried to lift her head, but her body was still weak. The cowboy stepped closer and gently placed a rolled blanket behind her shoulders to help her sit up. Breath. And looked at him again. Her face showed both fear and curiosity. She did not speak, but she did not pull away either. He held out the cup. "Water," he said, pointing to it. She hesitated, then reached out with shaking fingers. He guided the cup to her hands and let her hold it herself. She took a small sip, then another. The water seemed to give her a little strength, and her shoulders relaxed. The cabin felt smaller now that they were both awake. The walls, the shelves, the table, everything seemed closer. The cowboy stepped back and sat on the chair again, giving her space. They stayed like that for a long moment, watching each other. The woman was the first to speak, though her voice was quiet and rough from the cold. The words were not ones he knew, but he understood the meaning in her tone. She was asking a question. He pointed to himself. "I live here," he said slowly. Then he pointed to the fire and the blankets. "You were in the snow." "I brought you in." She listened carefully, even if she did not understand every word. Break. She touched the blanket around her shoulders and looked down at her hands, then back at him. Her eyes softened just a little. She spoke again, this time using simple words he recognized.
"River,"
she said, pointing toward the window.
"River," she said, pointing toward the window.
He nodded. "Yes. I found you near the river." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if remembering something. When she opened them again, there was a shadow in them. She placed her hand over her heart and said a name, one he did not recognize. The cowboy did not ask her to repeat it. He understood enough to know that she was thinking about someone else, someone who was not here. He stood up and walked to the small table. From a pot, he took out a piece of bread and broke it in half. He held one piece out to her. She looked at it, then at him, unsure. He placed it gently on a cloth near her and stepped back. After a moment, she picked it up and took a small bite. The warmth of the food seemed to bring a little color back to her face. Outside, the storm had passed, but the land was still quiet and cold. The sky was clear, and the snow shined under the pale sunlight. The cowboy knew the cold would stay for many days. The winter was far from over. As the morning went on, the woman grew a little stronger. She shifted her position and pulled the blanket closer around herself. She looked around the cabin with more interest now, noticing the tools on the shelves, the old boots near the door, and the small marks on the wall where the cowboy had measured the height of the snow each winter. She pointed to a wooden carving near the window. It was a simple shape of a horse that the cowboy had made long ago, just to pass the time. He smiled slightly. "I made that," he said. She reached out and touched it, running her fingers along the smooth edges. She nodded, as if showing her approval. They did not talk much after that.
Words were still hard to share between them.
Instead, they used small gestures. He showed her where the water was kept. She showed him how to wrap the blanket tight around her shoulders to keep the heat in. At one point she tried to stand. Her legs shook, and she almost fell. The cowboy moved quickly and held her arm to steady her. For a brief moment they stood very close. He could feel how thin she was, how tired her body still felt. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them now, only a quiet trust. He helped her back down to sit near the fire. "Take it slow," he said gently. The day moved forward, marked by the changing light in the window and the soft sounds of the fire. The cowboy stepped outside once to check on his horses and make sure the snow had not blocked the fence. When he came back in, he brought a small bundle of dry wood and shook the snow from his boots at the door. The woman watched him with interest, as if learning the rhythm of his life just by seeing him move through the small space. Later, she pointed to herself and said her name again more clearly this time. He tried to repeat it, but the sound did not come out right. Brit. He smiled a little at his effort, and that small smile felt like a warm light in the cold room.
He pointed to himself.
"I am the one who lives here," he said. He tapped his chest, giving her a simple way to remember it.
As the sun began to lower in the sky, the room filled with soft orange light. The fire glowed brighter, and the shadows on the walls grew longer. The woman sat quietly, looking out the window at the wide, white land. Her face showed a mix of peace and worry. She knew she could not stay here forever. Her path lay somewhere beyond the hills with people who were waiting for her. The cowboy felt the same thought settle in his mind. This moment, this shared space, was not meant to last. But for now, it was enough. He placed another piece of bread near her and filled the cup with warm water again. She accepted it with a small nod. As night began to fall, the cabin once again became a small island of light in a sea of snow and dark sky. The storm was gone, but the quiet remained. Inside, two people from different lives sat near the same fire, bound by a single act of kindness and a day of shared silence. Neither of them knew what the next morning would bring. The third morning arrived with a soft glow of light across the snow. The sky was clear and the air felt calm, as if the land itself was taking a deep breath after the storm. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned low, giving off a steady warmth that filled the small space with comfort. The woman was awake before the cowboy this time. Psst. She sat up slowly, careful with each movement. Her body still felt weak, but there was more strength in her hands and legs than before. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked around the cabin, now familiar with its simple shapes and quiet corners. The table, the chairs, the shelves, the small carving near the window. Each thing felt like a part of a story she was slowly learning. When the cowboy opened his eyes, he saw her sitting near the fire. For a moment he felt surprised, then quietly pleased. He stood up, stretched his arms, and walked to the shelf to prepare water and food for the morning. She watched him move, noticing how he worked with care, even with small tasks. He poured water, warmed it near the fire, and broke bread into smaller pieces to make it easier for her to eat. He handed her the cup and sat down across from her. They shared the quiet of the morning, listening to the soft sound of wood popping in the fire and the distant call of a bird outside. After she finished drinking, she pointed toward the door. "Outside," she said softly. The cowboy hesitated. The cold was still strong, and he was not sure she was ready. But when he saw the look in her eyes, he understood. She needed to feel the world beyond the walls again, even if only for a moment. He nodded. "Slow," he said, holding up one finger. He helped her stand and wrapped an extra coat around her shoulders. Together, they moved toward the door. The cold air rushed in as he opened it, and a bright white world greeted them. The snow sparkled under the sun and the sky stretched wide and blue above the valley. The woman took a slow step outside, her boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. She breathed in the cold air, closing her eyes for a moment. The cowboy stood nearby, ready to catch her if she lost her balance. But she stayed steady. She looked around, her eyes moving across the hills, the frozen river, and the long path that disappeared into the distance. Her face changed as she took it all in. There was longing there, and memory. She pointed toward the hills and spoke in her own language, her voice carrying a tone of sadness and hope at the same time. The cowboy did not understand the words, but he understood the feeling. They walked a few steps together, staying close to the cabin. The woman bent down and touched the snow, letting it run through her fingers. She smiled faintly, as if remembering something from another time, another place. After a few minutes, her legs began to shake again. The cowboy noticed right away and gently guided her back inside. Once she was seated near the fire, he placed a blanket over her shoulders again. He poured more water and set it beside her. The moment outside had taken some of her strength, but it had also given her something else, a reminder of who she was and where she belonged. As the day went on, they began to share more of their stories, not through long talks, but through small signs and simple words. The woman picked up a small piece of wood and used her finger to draw shapes on the dusty floor. She drew a line of hills, a river, and several small figures walking together. Narration. The cowboy watched closely. She pointed to one of the figures and touched her chest. Then she pointed to the others and stretched her hand outward, as if showing distance between them. He nodded. Your people, he said softly. She looked at him and nodded back. He picked up a stick and drew a small cabin near the edge of her picture. Then he pointed to himself and to the cabin. She smiled gently, understanding. They both sat back and looked at the simple drawing on the floor. It showed two paths that had crossed for a short time, even though they came from very different places. Later, the cowboy went outside to gather more wood. The woman stayed near the window, watching him as he moved through the snow. She noticed how the land seemed to respond to him, how the horses in the distance lifted their heads when he walked by. Narration. When he came back in carrying a bundle of wood, she stood up and tried to help. She reached out to take a small piece from his arms. He laughed quietly and handed her one of the lighter sticks. She held it carefully, proud to be doing something on her own. They placed the wood near the fire together. The day passed with small tasks and quiet moments. He fixed a loose board on the shelf. She folded the blankets and set them neatly near the bed. They worked side by side without needing many words. As the light outside began to fade again, the woman sat down and looked tired. The cowboy noticed the way her shoulders drooped and her eyes grew heavy. He handed her a cup of warm water and waited as she drank slowly. Then she surprised him. She reached into a small pouch tied to her belt and pulled out a thin strip of leather with a simple pattern carved into it. She held it out to him. He took it carefully, looking at the markings. They were small shapes, carved with care and meaning. She placed her hand over her heart and then gently touched his arm, offering the strip to him. He understood. It was a gift. He did not know the full meaning behind it, but he knew it was important. He nodded and held it close to his chest for a moment before tying it around his wrist. She smiled, a real and open smile this time. The cowboy felt something warm spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire. In return, he stood up and walked to the shelf. He took down the small wooden horse carving from the window. He handed it to her. Her eyes widened as she took it. She turned it over in her hands, tracing the shape with her fingers. She looked up at him, surprised and touched. They sat in silence for a long moment, holding each other's gifts. Outside, the sky turned deep blue, and the first stars appeared. The woman looked at the stars through the window, then pointed to one that shone brighter than the others. She said a few words in her own language, her voice soft and full of meaning. The cowboy listened, even though he did not understand. He felt the weight of the moment, the sense that she was sharing something close to her heart. As night fell, the cabin once again became a place of light and warmth in the cold valley. Breath. The woman lay down near the fire, holding the wooden horse close to her chest. The cowboy sat in his chair, the leather strip tied around his wrist. Psst. They both felt the quiet pull of what was coming next. The woman would not stay forever. Her strength was returning. Her path was waiting. The cowboy knew this, even though neither of them spoke the words. He looked at the fire, watching the flames rise and fall. He thought about how quickly life could change, how one moment by a frozen river could lead to days that would stay in his memory forever. The woman turned her head and looked at him. Their eyes met. There was gratitude there, and something else, something like understanding. They did not need to speak it. They both knew that their time together was becoming something they would carry with them long after the snow melted and the valley changed again. The night grew quiet. The fourth morning began with a gentle sound at the cabin door. It was not loud or sudden, just a soft knock made by the wind pushing a loose branch against the wood. The cowboy woke and sat up, listening for a moment before he realized what it was. The fire had burned low again, and the room felt cool but calm. He stood and added fresh wood to the flames. The light returned, filling the cabin with warm colors. He turned and saw the woman already awake, sitting near the fire with the wooden horse in her hands. She looked peaceful, but there was a quiet focus in her eyes, as if her thoughts were far away. He poured water into the cup and warmed it, then placed it near her. She thanked him with a small nod and took a slow sip. Outside, the sky was clear and bright. Range. The snow looked smooth and untouched, like a clean page waiting for new marks. The cowboy felt a sense of stillness in the air, the kind that comes before something changes. After she finished her drink, the woman stood and walked toward the window. She looked out across the valley, her eyes following the long path that disappeared between the hills. She turned back to the cowboy and pointed toward the path, then to herself. He understood. It was time. The thought settled in his chest, heavy but calm. He had known this day would come. The land did not hold people forever. It only gave them a place to rest before they moved on. He nodded slowly. "We'll get you ready," he said, even though he knew she might not understand every word. They spent the morning preparing. The cowboy took out a small bag made of thick cloth and began to fill it with simple supplies. He placed pieces of bread inside, a small bottle of water, and a warm scarf. He added a simple tool for cutting and a piece of dry wood wrapped in cloth to help start a fire if she needed one. The woman watched him with quiet attention. When he finished, she took the bag and checked each item, as if learning how he thought and planned. She added a small bundle of dried plants from her own pouch, placing them carefully inside. They worked together without rushing, moving around the cabin in a slow and steady rhythm. Later, the cowboy stepped outside to prepare his horses. The woman followed him, wrapped in the coat he had given her. The cold air touched their faces, but the sun was warm enough to make it gentle. The horses stood near the fence, their breath rising in white clouds. They lifted their heads when the cowboy approached, recognizing his steps. The woman watched them with interest and a hint of wonder. She reached out slowly, and one of the horses leaned forward, sniffing her hand before allowing her to touch its neck. She laughed softly, a sound like a small bell in the quiet valley. The cowboy smiled. "Bread," He had not heard that sound in a long time. They walked back toward the cabin, and the woman stopped near the frozen river. She looked down at the place where he had found her days before. She stood very still, as if honoring that moment, that thin line between life and loss that had brought them together. She knelt and placed her hand on the snow, then stood and faced the cowboy. She placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly. He felt the meaning in the gesture. He touched a leather strip on his wrist, then placed his hand over his heart in return. The wind moved gently around them, carrying the sound of the river beneath the ice back inside the cabin. They shared one last simple meal: bread, warm water, and quiet. The woman tied the small bag over her shoulder and adjusted the coat around herself. She picked up the wooden horse and held it close, then looked around the cabin one more time. Her eyes moved over the walls, the table, the fire, and the small shelf. She was taking the place with her, storing it in her memory. The cowboy stood near the door, watching her. She walked toward him and stopped. For a moment, they stood close, not touching, just sharing the space between them. She reached out and gently touched the leather strip on his wrist. Then she pointed to the wooden horse in her hands. They both nodded. He opened the door, and bright light filled the cabin. Outside, the path across the valley waited. The woman stepped out first. The snow crunched under her boots. She turned back and looked at the cowboy, her eyes full of warmth and thanks. He raised his hand in a small wave. She took a few steps, then stopped and looked back again. She lifted the wooden horse slightly, as if showing him she would keep it close. Then she turned and began to walk. The cowboy stood in the doorway, watching her move across the wide land. Her figure grew smaller with each step, blending into the white and blue of the valley. He stayed there long after she was no longer in sight. The wind moved through the hills, and the quiet returned. He closed the door and went back inside the cabin. The space felt different now. The fire still burned. Breath. The table still stood. The shelves still held his tools. But something else lingered in the air. Something he could not see. A memory. He sat in his chair and looked at the empty space near the fire where she had rested. He thought about the drawing on the floor, the simple lines that showed two paths crossing. But he thought about the small laugh by the horses and the way she had touched the snow by the river. He tied the leather strip tighter around his wrist, feeling its weight and its meaning. Outside, the sun moved across the sky, and the shadows changed. The cowboy stood and went back to his daily tasks, but he checked the fence. He fed the horses. But he gathered more wood. The land still needed him, just as it always had. But now, as he worked, he felt something new inside him, a quiet strength that came from knowing he had been part of something beyond his own small life. As evening fell, he returned to the cabin and lit the fire again. The light filled the room, warm and steady. He sat down and looked at the door. He knew she was out there somewhere, walking toward her people, carrying a small wooden horse and a story she would one day tell. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the fire fill the space. The valley outside was still wide and quiet. The fifth morning came with a quiet kind of light, the soft gold of the sun touching the snow and turning it into a wide field of gentle shine. The cowboy stood in the doorway of his cabin looking out across the valley. The path the woman had taken was no longer clear. The wind had brushed over the snow and erased most of her footprints. Only a faint line remained, like a memory that refused to fade. He stepped outside and pulled his coat tighter around himself. The air was cold, but it did not feel as sharp as before. Or maybe he had grown used to it. He walked a few steps toward the frozen river and stopped at the place where he had first seen her lying in the snow. The river was still hidden under a sheet of ice, but he could hear the soft movement of water beneath it. He stood there for a long moment, thinking about how close life can come to slipping away without a sound. He thought about how one small choice, one step forward instead of back, had changed 2 lives. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. When, inside, the fire waited to be lit. He placed fresh wood inside and struck a small spark. Soon the flames rose again, filling the room with warmth and light. The cabin felt empty, but not in a lonely way. It felt full of quiet memories. He sat at the small table and took out the simple drawing he had made on a piece of old paper. The hills, the river, the 2 paths that crossed. He traced the lines with his finger, then folded the paper and placed it on the shelf beside his tools. The day moved forward, slow and steady. He fed the horses, checked the fence, and cleared snow from the path near the cabin. The land still asked for his care, and he gave it, one small task at a time. But as he worked, his mind often drifted to the woman walking somewhere beyond the hills. He imagined her finding her people, sharing warm food, and sitting near another fire, under another sky. He imagined her showing them the wooden horse, telling them about the quiet cabin in the valley and the man who lived there alone. The thought made him smile. In the afternoon, he noticed a change in the sky. The clouds moved slowly, forming soft shapes above the hills. It looked like the land was opening itself again, ready for new travelers, new stories. He decided to take a walk. He followed the edge of the frozen river, moving carefully across the snow, but he did not know why he walked that way. Maybe he just wanted to feel closer to the path she had taken. As he walked, he found a small mark in the snow, half covered by the wind. It looked like the print of a boot, faint but still there. He stopped and looked down at it. He placed his own boot beside it. The 2 marks stood together for a moment, one old and one new, side by side. He nodded to himself, then turned back toward the cabin when evening came. The sky filled with soft colors, pink, blue, and gold, stretched across the horizon, painting the valley in quiet beauty. The cowboy stood outside and watched the sun sink behind the hills. He felt a deep calm in his chest. Back inside, he prepared a simple meal and sat near the fire. The flames moved gently, casting warm light on the walls. The wooden horse was no longer on the shelf, but its empty space felt just as meaningful. He reached down and touched the leather strip on his wrist. It had become a part of him now, a small reminder of a meeting that had changed his way of seeing the world. As the night grew darker, he lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling. The quiet of the valley settled around the cabin, deep and peaceful. He thought about the life he had chosen. The long days alone, the simple work, the wide land that had been both his home and his shelter. He had believed this was all he needed, base plane. Now he knew something else. Even the quietest life can hold moments that echo far beyond a single place or time. The next morning he woke with a new kind of energy. He stepped outside and looked across the valley again. The world felt open, wide, and full of possibility. He began to make small changes to the cabin. He fixed a loose board near the door. He cleared more space near the fire. He even placed a second chair closer to the table, even though no one else lived there. It was not because he expected someone to arrive. It was because he knew the world could surprise him. Days turned into weeks. The snow slowly began to soften under the sun. The river whispered a little louder beneath the ice. Birds returned to the valley, their calls filling the air with gentle sound. The cowboy continued his work, but he also took more time to sit outside, to watch the sky, to listen to the land. He felt connected to something larger now, something that stretched beyond his own small life. One afternoon, as he sat near the river, he took out a small piece of wood in his carving tool and began to shape another horse, slow and careful. As he worked, he thought about the woman walking under a different sky, carrying her own memories of the valley. He smiled as he carved, knowing that somewhere far away 2 stories were still moving forward, separate but linked by a single moment in the snow. When he finished, he held the small wooden horse in his hands. It was not perfect, but it was made with care. He placed it on the shelf beside the drawing and the tools. The cabin once again held a small sign of connection, a quiet symbol of kindness that had passed through its door and left a lasting mark. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars filled the sky outside, the cowboy sat in his chair and looked around the room. He did not feel alone. He felt part of a wide world, one where paths cross, even in the coldest and quietest places. Brett. Somewhere beyond the hills, the woman walked her own path and carrying her own story forward. And in the valley, the cowboy carried his. The land held both of them in its quiet memory. A frozen river, a small cabin, and a single choice that turned into a bond of respect, care, and hope. The fire crackled softly. The night listened.